Many thanks to the Secretary of State and to Anne Richards for their speeches and for what I'm sure you'll agree was a fascinating conversation. And I think we all take on board the message of a Team UK approach. This is not just down to government, it is also down to industry to play its part. That leads us very neatly into our first panel session of the day around navigating competition among the economic superpowers, which will look at how changing global dynamics are shaping competition for international capital flows and leadership in technology, such as in AI and in digital infrastructure, and also looking at what are the implications of many of the things that Anne and Peter were talking about, of this dynamic environment, and what that means for the UK as an international financial centre as it seeks to balance engagement with the three economic superpowers, the US, the EU and China, and deepen its engagement with mid-sized economies and emerging exciting markets such as India, as we were just talking about. We have a terrific panel to look at this, and it is led and chaired by the inestimable Chris Hayward, the policy chairman of the City of London Corporation and also the deputy chair of the City UK board. Joe Cassidy, partner and head of technology, media and telecoms at KPMG UK, and also the co-chair of the City UK's Defence and Resilience Group and the chair of its Swiss Market Advisory Group. Rebecca Park, partner at FGS Global. Anna Rosenberg, head of politics at Amundi Investment Institute, and Nabeel Yousef, partner at Freshfields. Can you please welcome them to the stage?
Why don't we quickly, in whatever order you want to go. Go on. Well, a very good morning to everyone. It's great to be here at TC UK's International Conference. Thank you, Miles, for your very generous introduction to myself and to this very distinguished panel that I'm going to be talking to this morning. And thank you for all your leadership of the City UK. You do an absolutely great job. So this first panel session of the conference this morning, as Miles said, is quite properly global in its dimensions. For as we convene here this morning, we do so against a backdrop of radical and escalating geopolitical uncertainty. As collective assumptions are tested like never before and old orthodoxies evaporate, the UK confronts both a challenge and also a compelling opportunity. Our strong institutions, rule of law, stable government and long-standing commitment to open competitive markets. These are, I think, not just valuable inheritances, they enable us to forge strong and constructive ties across a broad range of international partners in established and emerging markets. Indeed, the continued success of this country's financial and professional services sector depends on our ability to maintain a diversified global outlook. As capital flows are disrupted and market fragmentation proliferates. And underlying it all, as the geostrategic competition between the US, the EU and China intensifies, the UK's proposition continues to stand apart as a strategically connected financial centre, balancing engagement across different blocks and staunchly defending a culture of openness, trust and competitiveness. So I'm now going to move into some questions to the panel. You know who they are. Miles has introduced them to you, so I won't go through their glorious biographical details all over again, but I'm going to put a few questions, and then do think of your own questions, and if we have time, we'll take those, and also those that come in online as well, those watching us. So if we go first of all onto the subject of the global geoeconomic landscape and the growing weaponization of trade and technology, if I turn to Anna first of all, can I ask Anna, how are the geopolitical cards likely to land over the next 3 years, do you think? And what scenarios should businesses be preparing for?
Easy question there, 3 years. Okay, so let me first take a little bit of a historical perspective to set us where we are today. And then we can talk about where we're likely going to head. And I think the questions on scenarios businesses have to prepare for is obviously complex, and we can talk about that for the whole day, but I'll try and give you some pointers. So let's look at the context. We are in a new geopolitical area that is clear. When we look at the data, what we can see, we grouped geopolitical regimes since the beginning of the 20th century, is that we are in an area where the long peace that was prevalent since the end of the Second World War is truly over. We can see this in the numbers. And the kind of conflict regimes that were prevalent in the 30s and 40s are coming back. We have the highest numbers of active conflicts ever since the Second World War. There are a lot of parallels of our current period with the pre-World War years, okay? And I think we have to accept this. The parallels mainly is that we have a growing number of conflicts and that there's some structural challenges in resolving them. So diplomacy is failing, and we're currently seeing this in the Middle East. This rising geopolitical risk level is going to continue to be with us for the next couple of years, at least for this decade. This is something that has been a long-standing assumption of ours, really since the beginning of this decade. And it's not because of Donald Trump. It's not because of what's happening in the Middle East right now. It's not because of tariffs. It's because of mega trends that have been playing out for several years. The mega trends are economic warfare that's been around for at least a decade. Sanctions, export controls, tariffs. Now we have naval blockades on top of this. We have the great power competition between the US and China. We have the political implications of climate change, new resource competition. We have a new arms and technology race. So that's just a few examples of the big drivers that are responsible for this rising level of geopolitical risk. So what does this mean specifically for the next 3 years? This is the new normal. We're going to be in an environment where we're going to have more conflicts, more flare-ups, some surprising, some less surprising, high levels of risk that these could go worse. That's an environment we have to accept. And I actually found it quite interesting what we heard from the Secretary of State earlier, in the sense that businesses have to adapt to this environment. Constantly, be agile, but that's what we do all the time anyway. So it's not just about risk. It is also that this environment provides new trends and opportunities for investment. What does it mean specifically for regions? I think there are a couple of things that we can take for granted. The direction of travel in Europe is one where I think we're going to be in. Right now, the EU and Europe more broadly is not a geopolitical superpower. It's maybe a middle power. But the direction of travel, where we see a lot more investments on defense, a lot more focus on autonomy, on lowering dependencies. I think in 3 years' time, we could be in a position where Europe emerges once again as a geopolitical heavyweight, if the right things are done. But I think right now the signs are there. The US, the question is, it displays all the elements of a hegemon in decline. Will it continue on that path? If you look at historical analogies, it is likely, but there is a spanner in the wheel, which is AI. AI may reverse this trend, so that's a question mark. The tensions in the South and East China Sea between the US and China are likely going to intensify. So that's, I think, a given. And then on Russia and Ukraine, in 3 years' time, this conflict has likely evolved in whatever shape or form. Maybe I'll leave it at that. That's the kind of world we have to deal with, accept it, embrace it, and just do business in it.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think that's a really good opening and a great analysis. You mentioned the US, and I'm going to turn to Nabeel now and actually say, how does the world look, Nabeel, from a US perspective? How do you see the US policies on trade and regulation playing out for US-based businesses? And what might that mean for traditional partners like us in the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think from the US perspective, it's increasingly looking like the world is a competitive zero-sum game, right? As opposed to the old systems of kind of friends and networks and allies that create these wonderful network effects. It is either the US has it or someone else has it, and sort of there's not really a whole lot in between, right? This idea of rising tides lifting all boats, and partnering is going to create more value. The current sort of perspective from the US is that the policy of the government is that is not our policy. I think the perspective on sort of the US's perspective on the world, I think really does start with China, right? And if we look at the way that the US has been approaching China, and I agree completely, Anna, this is not an overnight development. There are definitely some things that are catalyzing it rapidly in the current political environment, but the US perspective on China has been shaped over the course of the last decade on things like nearshoring, COVID, sanctions and export control restrictions, simple sort of policy preferences, political pressure. And I think that the US approach to China is starting to become the United States' approach to a lot of the rest of the world. And that is, I think, the current trend. And I think that's the thing that when we look even back to the Biden administration, even you could argue maybe even the end of the Obama administration, this was the direction of travel. I think we've seen a willingness to abandon sort of short-term gains for longer-term benefits on this grand path that the United States is starting to take. I think there was a view that the U.S. wasn't willing to absorb certain economic pain for a long-term gain on certain approaches. I mean, obviously, the United States' relationship with China going back, a generation has been, let's, manufacture less expensively, let's reduce the cost of everything, let's increase the standard of living, even if that means, decimating certain industries. Obviously, we're seeing a reversal of that trend, or I think we're trying to see a reversal of that trend in the U.S. I think for a country like the United Kingdom, necessarily you have to operate in this framework, right? Ignoring this framework or pretending like it doesn't exist, or frankly, pretending like things are going to go back to the way they were under the next U.S. presidential administration, I think is a fantasy, right? Again, I couldn't agree more with Anna's comments at the beginning. We are on a path right now, and that path is not going to lead us back to where we came from. While it certainly probably won't remain as volatile or as maybe activist as it is currently, this is definitely the path we're going down. And I think the question for a country like the UK, for other middle powers, is this going to start to look like, I use a different historical analogy than the pre-war era, is this going to basically look like a Cold War, right? Where certain countries have to walk a tightrope and they have to play both sides in order to get the greatest benefit? Do they have to take short-term tactical wins in the context of a longer-term strategy? And is that going to be the United Kingdom's approach? I think that's a bit of an open question, I think, in my mind. As it concerns the EU, just because you mentioned, and it's come up, I think the EU being kind of this third major power, I think there's not really nearly enough discussion, not just about how the US has been pulling back from Europe, but also how Europe is starting to pull back from the United States, right? I think we've seen, and I won't get into too much sort of detail on this, but I think the EU is, the knee-jerk reaction, right, would be to say, well, the US is acting somewhat erratically, it's an unusual posture in the current administration, we're just going to pull away from the US. Pulling away from the US, from the US perspective, looks just like moving closer to China. And moving closer to China is not without risks. Economic risk, competitive risk, technological risk. I mean, there are strings attached to everything. And I think from the US perspective, and I think we're starting to even see this, I think, from some of the EU regulators, they're starting to understand, well, letting in a flood of cheap Chinese EVs or whatever could really potentially long-term imperil a domestic economy. So I think the question from my perspective for the UK is, which model do you take, or do you find a third model that works for this country?
Thank you very much for that. Yeah. Rebecca, can I turn to you now? I mean, from your vantage point, advising global firms, what are the most pressing strategic risks and uncertainties that businesses are raising with you as geopolitics becomes a central driver of decision making?
I think if we kind of almost go back to kind of Anna's final sentence, which is, if this is the world in which we're now operating, we have to figure out what the consequences of that are and how that matters and how that works. And I think there are kind of two core themes that we're really seeing coming through. One is we have to accept that regulatory fragmentation is now structural. It's not technical. There won't just be one Basel endgame. There will be multiple Basel endgames. The gravity with which Basel and that multilateral framework has held is weakening. And however much we want to talk about the benefits of alignment, the competitive benefits, the growth benefits, the reduced costs, that is no longer a realistic understanding of the world in which we're operating. And I think really starting to grapple with the consequences of that, how we think about it for operating models, structural models, where we'll see different centres of growth coming forward is going to be key for businesses. But also thinking about what that means for the rules we haven't yet written. You know, as we're designing new regulatory frameworks, you know, the regulatory frameworks we write in the next 2 years on tokenization, digital finance, AI will govern how we operate financial markets for the next decade. And at the moment, we've decided we're doing that in isolation. We're doing it from a place of competition, and we're doing it to compete in quite defined manners. You don't have to be first anymore to say that you're setting the regulatory rulebook. It's very much now for firms who is shouting the loudest and who is posing the greatest consequences on us not choosing their regime as our overriding approach or structure. And I think the way that we've seen that operate in stablecoins is a really clear example of some of the ways that we see those debates operating going forwards. But I think the second area is globalization, where it exists, is no longer about achieving growth. I think increasingly we have to accept it's about resilience. It's about how we're creating resilient structures for our economies, protective structures for our economies. And you know, we've had the strategic autonomy conversation, but now we can see that through the way that it's approaching data sovereignty, digital sovereignty, but also even just the sovereignty of our payments and our monetary system. If you're the European Union right now, in sovereign terms, less than a third of the payments being made by your citizens are sovereign. They are entirely operated through US and international rails and payment structures. And therefore thinking about what the consequences of that are when you're looking at traditional trading partners and allies and questioning whether those partnerships will remain uninterrupted in the future puts a very different complexion on that situation. And we see it in very practical terms. You know, I think across the G20 now, half are reviewing their critical national infrastructure and procurement terms within financial services to consider what their exposure to US tech is. This isn't exposure to Chinese tech. This is exposure to systems and payment structures that we've relied on for decades. And I think those two features on fragmentation and resilience are really driving both business operations, but also how we think about the frameworks that we're going to get.
Thank you very much. Joe, turning to you, if I may now. Turning to the intersection of technology, defense, and financial services, how are developments in AI, digital infrastructure, and national resilience reshaping the competitive landscape between major economies and financial centers?
So just picking up Rebecca's last point, if I just build on that for a second, short-term resilience is an interesting question with mythos. Okay, and the current set of agents, which are broadly covered. My original background is I was a hacker and cryptographer, so I used to design secure networks and payment systems, and it's kind of interesting. Some of the technology that I was probably involved in building is still around in some institutions, and that was 35 years ago. And what are these agents doing? They're exploiting that heritage technology and the more recent technologies. And basically being able to sort of factor in all of the weaknesses, small vulnerabilities, and the compound effect. And that's what people are worried about. Now, people think that that's going to be like 5 years away. It's not. It's probably 6 months away. So we got a short-term resilience thing. Now, that's a really important point for this group, this city in its broadest sense, and financial services, because we are based on a foundation of law, language, time zone, and the fact that that system's infrastructure and the payments infrastructure around it is going to continue to function. I think that's the biggest vulnerability right now around resilience for this group in this room and more broadly. The second thing, and Rebecca highlighted it as well, which is the dependency on US tech. I spend a lot of time, one of the things that I do a lot is look for indigenous technology companies in the UK and in Europe who are building out competitive technologies to the US companies. That's not because I don't like the US technologies, but clearly over the last 2-3 years, what we've seen is that people want sovereign tech, and they want data sovereignty, and they want data center infrastructure aligned to that as well. And you're seeing in Germany, and you're seeing it in KSA, where it's not just the data localization and the data sovereignty, or even the supply chain, to the extent that anybody can have a sovereign supply chain, and the air gap nature of the center. But now people like Amazon and others are having to compromise and stand up legally bankruptcy remote vehicles, a bit like ring-fence banks, if you think about them that way, for data centers in these jurisdictions. So we're seeing a development in those areas, and this is about control. I don't want to be dictated to. I want to have some sovereign agency, if you will, around my citizens' data, my infrastructure, my national critical infrastructure in its broadest sense. And again, it builds on kind of the sum of the story. Now, one of the other things that then lends itself to is, how do I actually in a sovereign sense, defend myself? If we look at, I co-chair obviously with General Sir Richard Barron's, the Defence and Resilience Group, and he and I talk about this a lot at this moment in time. There is a high likelihood there is a trigger of Article 5. And the question is that like a little trip, or is it a big trip of Article 5? And what is the response in those circumstances? Now, I think there's when that test eventually comes around, people will start to understand am I on my own or not? And who are my friends in those circumstances? And I'm neither in Nabeel's camp, nor am I in Anna's camp necessarily in evolution. My kind of history is looking a little bit further back, and if I'm looking at anything at the moment, I'm probably looking at a middle country Westphalian alliance, right? So where you wouldn't, the middle countries get together and they don't allow the biggest country to run over them. And I think that's where a lot of the security and defence is starting to align. So we are seeing in the UK procurement, for instance, the UK is teaming up both with the Finns and the Netherlands, and jointly procuring in that sense. The City UK group, we've had some very interesting conversations on the UK-German corridor, because there is strong alignment there. And it's easier to move fast with somebody who's committed than it is to move fast and try to get 27 or 30 in a room and get a consensus. So, and then the Five Eyes question it is an interesting kind of, because that's sharing intelligence, obviously. But the reconfiguration, I don't see this reconfiguration taking place over 5 or 10 years. I see some of this really, really quickly. And I just want to pick up on one last point about trade agreements. I learned a lot when I was working with the team on the UK-Swiss financial services and FTA. And the architecture there, the interesting thing is when you don't do financial services on its own, because when you do a free trade agreement, you have an FS chapter and you have a data and digital chapter in there. So you have to line the two things up. And sharing of data cross-border is fundamental for finance, trade, all of these kind of things. Now, the interesting thing is, start to unpack the US trade agreements. And there is sort of this thing called anti-deactivation clauses in US trade agreements, which is kind of interesting because it forces all the other countries to accept US marketplaces within their domain effectively and not unpack that. And I think this is where I probably see a break occurring. If there is a break on the US administration around some of these things, it probably comes from big tech, because their value is going to get eroded if the people start pushing back on this situation. So sanity or the leveling force probably comes from that direction.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to now sort of narrow the aperture somewhat. I'd like to pivot the discussion onto what these shifts mean for the UK's role as an international financial centre and how we understand our advantages in a more contested environment. Joe, you just mentioned the Berne Financial Services Agreement. I'm just back from Switzerland where I was promoting that agreement. And I'm struck by just how compelling the Swiss offer can be. Parallel to our own, it's a stable financial services centre within Europe, but outside of the EU. So Anna, could I ask you to say, what role you think Europe could play in this new global environment, and what role can the United Kingdom play, and how can it best leverage its distinctive strengths?
Okay, so I think we need to unpack a couple of things that were said, because we have a couple of things that are playing out. On the one hand, there is the global erosion of trust. Trust against everyone really is going to be reduced. As Nabeel said, everything has strings attached. Yet we no longer can allow strings to be attached to the degree they have been because it makes us vulnerable. It's about leverage in this world. You need to have leverage. Ideally, you have military power that gives you leverage. You have natural resources that gives you leverage. But there are other things that give you leverage. And I think especially in Europe, we need to think about what leverage do we have. So on the one hand, we have this erosion of trust in the world. And on the other hand, we have a multipolar world and what we like to call controlled disorder. Controlled disorder is the fact that, as we heard earlier, a lot of countries are trying to make up for failing multilateralism by starting new trade deals. So we actually have a lot of new trade deals. We have a lot of new security alliances as well, Saudi Arabia with Pakistan. So everyone's kind of trying to compensate for what's going on. So you have these two parallels playing out at the same time. Lack of trust, and at the same time trying to compensate for that by entering into new alliances. The reality, though, is that the lack of trust will, I think, remain more important, because your alliance today or your new treaty today may become your frenemy tomorrow because you have different geostrategic goals. So that brings you back to the fact that you need to have leverage. You need to lower your dependencies. And then we also have to be realistic. The US will always remain, as long as we are in this current world order, and there are no major frictions to the fundamental pillars of US foreign policy. We haven't seen those yet, which is NATO membership, which is freedom of navigation. As long as we haven't seen those things go out of the window, the US is going to be the key ally for European security. Why? Because we haven't spent the money, and we are not willing, and we don't have it, to really secure European security. And also the US doesn't want that, because they don't want a repeat of World War I, World War II, where European powers became the biggest enemy of the US. The US, the Supreme Commander of NATO, is always an American. That will remain the case, even if the Europeans are building a bigger pillar within NATO. Okay? So clearly we have to de-risk from the US, but we also shouldn't delude ourselves that it is currently feasible for the US to become a rival similar to China. It's a different thing. But to answer your question about what the UK and what Europe can do, I think it is back to my point about building leverage. In technology, how do you build leverage? Well, you have companies, you support small, medium-sized companies that provide the one little thing, ingredient, the little bolt or whatever it is, that all the tech companies depend on. So that when someone tightens your screw, you can tighten that screw. And I think this issue, this is how we need to think about all the trade deals, all agreements that we have. Where do we have the leverage? And also to the US say, look, NATO, yeah, may be good for us, but actually it makes you stronger. You are benefiting from NATO because neither Russia nor China has NATO. So kind of talking up our strengths. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much. The clock is beginning to beat us, so I'll ask our panelists to keep their remarks relatively brief now. Anna, Rebecca, is it realistic for the UK to maintain deep engagement with all three major economic superpowers, the US, the EU and China, or will we have to make choices, do you think? Where might the UK's position outside any bloc offer advantages?
I mean, I think the approach the UK has taken to date is one of necessity rather than it is avoiding deliberately having to make that choice. And that has to be the continued route through that the UK pursues. We're not going to see the UK shifting away from the kind of the economic cooperation and alignment that it wants to have with China. We just heard very clearly from the Secretary of State the importance of those relationships, the amount of cabinet time that is being spent very carefully designing those frameworks for discussion, greater alignment and opportunity investment. And for a government who's already turned a growth strategy into a cost of living strategy, we can't see them stepping away from one of the core pillars of their growth plans. But that will become harder in the current political framework. And I think actually one of the real risks is it will be businesses that get caught in those crosshairs, as they are the ones left trying to navigate very clear messages from the US, mixed messages coming potentially from parts of continental Europe, and then trying to work within the frameworks that the UK government is setting for them. But I thought we also have to be realistic about the role that the UK is playing. Yes, we can absolutely talk up our strengths. We should talk up our strengths. We need to stop talking down the competitiveness elements of the UK, and we heard those articulated very clearly this morning. But we also have to accept we are also delivering quite significant amounts of political instability, and companies and investors will react to that. It's very hard to sit here today and say confidently, this is what the UK political regime looks like on the 8th of May. And that's been true now since before 2015. And when you talked about political instability to international investors a decade ago, people would rightly roll their eyes at you and say, London doesn't know what political instability looks like. I'm very confident talking up London to my international investors. We no longer get to play that card in the same way, and therefore we can't overstate how our actions are going to be interpreted. We're very much sitting as a middle power, but as a middle power aligned with other middle powers, rather than necessarily dictating terms on our own.
Thank you very much. And Nabeel, from a legal and a regulatory perspective, how are shifting regimes in the US, EU, China and other jurisdictions affecting cross-border structuring and market access? What does this mean for the United Kingdom's role as a gateway and a convener?
Absolutely. I'll make this very brief. 3 quick points. The first is we are in a new legal and regulatory environment, one that I don't think we've ever seen before, where the United States is restricting market access in a more significant way using tools like foreign investment review, sanctions, export controls, tariffs. But the counterpoint to that, which I think is truly kind of remarkable, has been China's retaliatory actions, the EU's anti-coercion tools. I mean, the factors that companies have to think about when making investments into the US market are no longer solely about sort of the commercials of accessing the US market. It's about the politics and the regulations that could actually drastically impact that investment in the US, and then also how that would be seen by one of the other major powers, whether that would be seen as hostile, frankly, to that, and whether, when we look at, for example, the Greenland crisis, which is somewhat resolved, but not really completely resolved. The EU has done something absolutely extraordinary, which is to say, if the United States takes certain steps, we are actually going to, create the fracture affirmatively, potentially, and that would be targeting U.S. Companies that provide all sorts of major services. And when you talk about big tech, I think big tech was very much in the crosshairs in the anti-coercion instrument discussions. The second point on this is, I think it's causing a reconsideration of where investment happens. I think I saw a statistic recently that 80-some% of EU institutional investments are made in the United States, right? All of these legal and regulatory regimes and this conflict that's occurring is causing the EU to start to reconsider, why are we making the vast majority of our institutional investments into a market that is not necessarily openly hostile to us, but is no longer taking a cooperative view, but is taking a competitive zero-sum view of how we interact. And then the last point for the UK is, what does this mean for the UK? I think we saw in 2022 with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine that the UK really is the capital of the rest of the world. And what I mean by that is, even the largest, most domestic, most American companies in the world, when they were looking to exit Russia, all of their agreements were governed by UK law, were done through subsidiaries of UK companies. The UK already has that position. So I'm not so sure that the UK has much sort of market share to take from the US, I think the risk is actually potentially losing that position to other jurisdictions that are seen as more closely aligned with the EU or more closely aligned with China, whether that's an EU member state or it's a country like Singapore.
Thank you very much. Joe, final question to you, if I may. What should industry and government prioritise to ensure that the UK remains competitive on technology and resilience, particularly around AI, digital infrastructure and critical systems?
Energy cost. Simple as that. 15% of a customer's costs of a data center in the US are energy. 50%, 50 in the UK. If there's one thing that people are interested in, it doesn't matter if you're an investor outbound, inbound to here, or you're locally here, and everybody uses three key things: compute, data, and connectivity. And compute is the primary cost, and the highest correlation with compute is energy costs. So if Peter was back here, I said this to him in Birmingham last autumn, it's the same thing right now, energy cost.
Thank you very much indeed. My apologies to our audience, the clock has beaten me. I'm afraid I haven't any time to take audience questions on this occasion, but I hope you agree with me that it's been a fascinating discussion, and I want to thank my very distinguished panel very much for their contributions. Would you put your hands together, please, and thank them in the normal manner? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.